Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome back to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we continue our peaceful journey through England's worst kings in Part 4, a complete exploration of the final chapters of medieval kingship from 1483 to 1547. We'll softly explore the brief but tumultuous reign of Richard III, from his rise as protector of young Edward V to his coronation amid the mystery of the princes in the Tower, then gently transition to the transformative reign of Henry VIII, whose quest for a male heir would reshape England's religious landscape forever, all while the ancient world of feudal England gave way to the dawn of the Tudor era and the modern English state. Before you drift away into peaceful sleep, please take a moment to like this video, leave a gentle comment about which of these worst kings' stories intrigues you most, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the 15th and 16th centuries lull you into restful sleep. If you're following our England's Worst Kings series, thank you for joining us on this tranquil journey through history. Richard, later known as King Richard III of England, entered this world on the 2nd day of October in 1452, within the stone walls of Fotheringham Castle in Northamptonshire. Born to Richard Plantagenet, the mighty Duke of York, and Cecily Neville, Duchess of York, this infant prince would grow to become one of England's most debated rulers, the final monarch of the ancient Plantagenet bloodline. His mother, Cecily Neville, carried the noble heritage of King Edward III through her ancestry, while simultaneously bearing the responsibility of mothering to future Yorkist kings, Edward IV and Richard himself. Richard's father, the formidable Richard Plantagenet, stood as one of the most influential and commanding noblemen of his generation, serving repeatedly as protector of the realm during the troubled reign of the Lancastrian King Henry VI, and ultimately becoming the catalyst for that devastating conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. As the youngest of 4 surviving sons born to Cecily and York, young Richard appeared destined for a life far removed from royal power. Traditional expectations suggested he would never inherit his father's grand title, much less harbor any realistic claim to England's throne. Yet the relentless years of civil warfare and a sequence of momentous events would eventually elevate him to kingship, transforming him into one of the most notorious and enigmatic rulers in English historical memory. Richard's childhood unfolded against the backdrop of one of medieval Europe's bloodiest and most renowned conflicts, Wars of the Roses. This brutal struggle began when Richard reached merely 2 years of age, though its underlying causes stretched back much deeper into the complex web of Plantagenet dynastic politics. During the prosperous reign of King Edward III, England had emerged as one of medieval Europe's dominant superpowers, having crushed French armies in legendary battles such as Crécy and Poitiers. By Edward III's death, the island nation had achieved clear superiority over its continental rival. However, Edward III's eldest son and designated heir, Edward the Black Prince, widely regarded as one of medieval Europe's most accomplished and capable military commanders, never received the opportunity to rule as England's king. Death claimed him through dysentery a full year before his father's passing in 1376, which meant the crown passed instead to the Black Prince's young son, Richard II. Despite displaying considerable promise during the early phases of his reign, Richard II ultimately resembled his great-grandfather, Edward II, far more than his illustrious father and grandfather. He proved himself a weak, tyrannical, and cruel monarch who eventually alienated his nobles to the very brink of open rebellion. Consequently, Richard faced overthrow by his own nobles, who imprisoned him and condemned him to death by starvation. His cousin, Henry of Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, Earl of Lancaster, and third son of Edward III, carried out this execution. With Lancaster's heritage represented by the famous Red Rose, this act of regicide created a fundamental rift within the Plantagenet family tree and ultimately led to the Wars of the Roses. Bolingbroke had no legitimate claim as next in line following Richard II's death, and by murdering an anointed monarch, he established a dangerous precedent that would eventually place his descendants in direct conflict with other branches of the Plantagenet lineage. These rival branches descended from Edward III's second surviving son, Lionel of Antwerp, 1st Duke of Clarence, as well as his fourth surviving son, Edmund of Langley, 1st Duke of York, whose house rallied under the famous symbol of the White Rose. Following Richard II's death, Henry Bolingbroke received coronation as King Henry IV of England in 1399, and the House of Lancaster maintained control over the country for the subsequent 62 years, encompassing the reigns of King Henry V and his son, King Henry VI. However, the Lancastrian grip on England depended largely upon the strength and capability of the reigning monarch, and this hold on power evaporated during the reign of Bolingbroke's grandson, King Henry VI. Unlike his father, Henry V, who possessed remarkable talent for warfare, Henry VI showed no aptitude for military leadership and demonstrated far greater interest in constructing churches and universities than maintaining political power. Henry VI's precarious position became further complicated when he suffered his first mental breakdown in 1453, possibly resulting from his army's final defeat against the French in the 100 Years' War. This crisis led to Pricaboux III's father, Richard, Duke of York, being appointed protector of the realm while the king recovered. York claimed descent from Edmund of Langley, the first Duke of York, but his mother, Anne Mortimer herself, carried the bloodline of Edward III's second son, the Duke of Clarence. Her grandfather, Edmund Mortimer, 3rd Earl of March, had married Clarence's only daughter, Philippa. York's power and influence increased dramatically when he inherited the Duke of Clarence's claim to the throne through his mother Anne, following the death of her brother Edmund Mortimer, 5th Earl of March, who died without heirs in 1425. This inheritance effectively transformed him into one of England's wealthiest landowners. This maternal lineage formed the foundation of Richard, Duke of York's claim to the English throne and provided the fundamental reason for the Wars of the Roses. Although he descended from Edward III's fourth son, he now also represented the heir of Edward's second son, Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, who technically held priority in the line of succession following Richard II's death. York attempted to capitalize on Henry VI's weakness by demanding recognition as the rightful heir to the throne, but he inevitably faced fierce opposition from the king's Lancastrian supporters, most notably Queen Margaret of Anjou, who desperately wanted her infant son with Henry, Edward of Westminster, to succeed his father as king. Outraged by York's actions, Margaret formed a powerful coalition against him, and with support from other Lancastrian nobles, such as the Duke of Somerset, she pressured the king to remove York from his position as protector of the realm. Henry VI recovered from his illness in December 1454 and relieved York of his position, prompting Richard to gather his supporters and march on London, hoping for a final confrontation with Henry's Lancastrian advisor. The two factions met on May 22, 1455, in what historians regard as the opening battle of the Wars of the Roses, the First Battle of St. Alban. The Yorkists achieved victory over the Lancastrians. The Duke of Somerset lost his life, and Henry VI became a prisoner. Following this triumph, York once again received appointment as protector of the realm. But King Henry, after recovering from another stress-related breakdown, removed him from his position once again, largely at Queen Margaret's insistence. This prompted York to flee the country to Ireland, fearing for his life. While York remained in Ireland, his ally, Richard Neville, the 16th Earl of Warwick and Constable of Calais, used his power base in mainland France to launch raids against trade shipments in the English Channel. After failing to reunite with York in England during 1459, he returned a year later, captured London, and defeated the Lancastrians at the Battle of Northampton in July 1460. Following this victory, Queen Margaret and her son Edward of Westminster fled to Scotland, while King Henry once again became a prisoner. This time, York made clear his intention to claim nothing less than complete usurpation of Henry and assume the crown himself. However, he could not obtain Parliament's backing for such a drastic measure, and instead, a compromise emerged in October 1460, known today as the Act of Accord. This agreement stipulated that Henry VI would retain the throne until his death, when it would then pass to York and his heir, while the Queen rallied support in Scotland. Lancastrian nobles, including the new Duke of Somerset, to avenge his father's death at the First Battle of St. Albans, assembled their forces in the north. Their army eventually totaled approximately 15,000 men-at-arms and marched south with the objective of defeating York and restoring Henry VI to the throne. York marched north along with his second son Edmund to confront the Lancastrians, but he greatly underestimated the strength of his enemy's forces, as his Yorkist host consisted of only about 8,000 men. The two armies met at the Battle of Wakefield on December 30th, 1460, where the Lancastrians achieved victory and both York and his son perished. Following their victory over York, Queen Margaret returned to England and, along with her Lancastrian allies, defeated the Earl of Warwick in the Second Battle of St. Albans on February 17, 1461. After this engagement, Henry VI gained release from captivity after being discovered singing beneath a nearby tree. Following their victory, the Lancastrians advanced toward London, but found themselves barred from entering the city by its Yorkists supporting population, which resulted in Margaret making the fatal mistake of retreating to the north. To consolidate her support base, that the Lancastrian withdrawal allowed the late York's eldest son, Edward, the new Duke of York, who at 19 already possessed experience as a commander, to return to London in the following weeks. There, with backing from the Earl of Warwick, the Church, and the city's population, he proclaimed himself King Edward IV of England on March 4, 1461. This escalated the conflict to an entirely new level, as England now found itself with two competing kings, and with the country more divided than ever before. Further hostilities became inevitable. Both sides prepared themselves for a final confrontation. the young king gathered his supporters and marched toward his family's city of York, which the Lancastrians currently occupied. The two armies confronted one another on March 29, 1461, approximately 10 miles southwest of York. In the bloodiest battle in English history totened, the two armies, consisting of approximately 30,000 men on both sides, engaged in battle amid a snowstorm, and unparalleled slaughter ensued. However, the Yorkists, aided by King Edward's brilliant leadership, eventually achieved victory, and after the carnage subsided, the field lay littered with the bodies of approximately 28,000 men. While civil war raged in England, King Edward's younger brothers, George and Richard, had remained in the relative safety of the Low Countries. Following their brother's victory at Totan, they returned to the country and participated in Edward's coronation, after which George received the title Duke of Clarence and Richard became Duke of Gloucester. Following the Yorkist seizure of power, 12-year-old Clarence and 9-year-old Richard were placed under the care of the Earl of Warwick in his power base in the Yorkshire Dale. Over the coming years, both brothers received education and instruction in the art of warfare until they reached maturity. Growing up during the Wars of the Roses helped shape Richard into the man he would eventually become. Spending the majority of his teenage years under the tutelage of one of the most capable commanders of his day, Warwick, comes as no surprise that by the time he reached maturity, he had developed into a reputable leader in his own right. At 16, Richard began attending court and assuming responsibility for his estates. However, both his and his brother George's loyalty to King Edward would soon face testing, as divisions began forming within the House of York and its support base. The reason for this division was Edward's handling of government, as he had begun ignoring Warwick's advice. This rift between them widened to breaking point when Edward's secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, a common-born woman, became known in May 1464. This clandestine marriage ruined Warwick's plans to marry Edward to the eldest daughter of Louis XI of France, an arrangement the Earl had negotiated to secure diplomatic relations between the two kingdoms and preserve England's remaining French territories on the continent. Edward's reign had been relatively secure thus far, but his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville elevated both her and her lowborn family to dominant positions within the king's court. Over the coming years, they worked against the Earl of Warwick and weakened his position. Warwick withdrew from court to his Yorkshire estates in 1467, where he gathered supporters against the king, including Edward and Richard's brother, George, Duke of Clarence. Clarence joined Warwick because Edward had not permitted him to marry the Earl's daughter, and since King Edward had no heirs, Clarence hoped to claim the throne for himself as next in line. Warwick and Clarence's rebellion began in earnest 2 years later, in 1469, when Warwick's rebel army defeated a loyalist army at the Battle of Edgecote Moor on July 26. Following this victory, King Edward was taken into custody in Buckinghamshire as the Earl's prisoner. However, Warwick's grip over the country did not last long, as he proved unable to secure the nobility's backing to replace Edward. This resulted in Edward's release shortly afterward, and fearing reprisals, the rebel leaders fled to the continent in spring 1470. While in exile, Warwick and Clarence formed an alliance with the deposed Queen Margaret of Anjou, and they launched a combined invasion of England in September 1470 with support from the French king This meant that Edward IV and his brother Richard were forced to flee the country themselves and seek protection in Flanders. Warwick then re-established Henry VI as King of England in what became known as the Readeption, which later earned him the nickname the Kingmaker for his role in restoring the Lancastrians to power. Title reserved for few men in history's annals, Edward IV, now under protection of his brother-in-law, the Duke of Burgundy, returned to England along with Richard, landing in Yorkist supporting East Anglia on March 14, 1471. With 1,200 men, they marched to York, which opened its gates to greet them. Both Edward and Richard progressed south, gathering supporters as they traveled, including their brother George, Duke of Clarence, who had become alienated by Warwick after he restored the Lancastrians to power. The Yorkist army then engaged the Earl of Warwick at the Battle of Barnet on April 14, 1471, where Richard, Duke of Gloucester, would truly come of age. In the battle, which thick mist shrouded, the Lancastrians initially gained the upper hand after their right flank, led by John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, routed the Yorkist left under William Lord Hastings. Even though Edward had lost a sizable portion of his army, both he and his brother Richard refused to allow it to crumble, and after Richard led his own attack on Warwick's left, the line stabilized. Then, in a moment of confusion, Oxford's men, who had returned to the fray, lost their way in the fog and charged toward their own lines, led by Warwick's brother John Neville. Neville, in turn, mistook them for Edward's Yorkist reserves and ordered his men to fire a volley of arrows at the approaching cavalry. In the hail of arrows, Oxford's men fled the field, crying treachery, after which Edward deployed his reserves to attack the Lancastrian left, culminating in their remaining ranks being decimated and Warwick, the Kingmaker, being cut down and killed. Richard had played a significant role in the Yorkist victory at Barnet, but almost immediately faced another opportunity to display his talent for command against another Lancastrian army less than a month later. In the Battle of Tewkesbury on May 4, 1471, in the lead-up to the battle, King Edward intercepted Margaret of Anjou, who had gathered her remaining support in the West Country and was travelling onward to Wales to join forces with Welsh noble Jasper Tudor, brother of Edmund Tudor and father of Henry Tudor. During the battle, Edward and Clarence's formations were initially overcome by an attack from Edmund, Duke of Somerset, but were relieved by supporting cavalry, which routed the Lancastrians. Richard then launched an attack on the Lancastrian center and forced the enemy back until their lines broke and a rout ensued. The victory at Tewkesbury proved to be the decisive battle in securing the crown for Edward IV, as it virtually eliminated the major Lancastrian claimants to the throne, including Henry VI's son, Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales, who died in the battle, the only heir apparent ever to die in battle on English soil. After the battle, Queen Margaret was taken prisoner by the House of York, and Richard, along with John Howard, Duke of Norfolk, reportedly put the remaining Lancastrian nobles to death, despite them taking sanctuary in Tewkesbury Abbey. This act of apparent murder was later used by his detractors in following centuries to portray Richard as a lawless character, though whether the monastery held sanctuary rights at that time has since been contested. Following Tewkesbury, a Lancastrian uprising led by the late Kingmaker's cousin, Thomas Neville, was defeated, and afterward King Henry VI was murdered in the Tower of London on the vigil of the Ascension. Between May 21st and 22nd, 1471, eliminating the final king of the Lancastrian era. Traditionally, Richard has been implicated in Henry's death, with some claiming he even sanctioned the killing, but this remains another matter of contention, as there exists no objective way to clarify who ordered his execution. What seems most likely, however, is that the late king died under Edward IV's orders, as he was, after all, the head of state, and only he possessed the authority to sanction the killing of an anointed monarch. By this stage, the House of York had achieved victory, having annihilated its rivals and effectively ended the conflict. A period of peace followed, though eventually the storm clouds of treachery and war would descend across England once again, and in time lead to the downfall of the Yorkist king. Following Edward IV's restoration in June 1471, Richard married Anne Neville, the younger daughter of the late Warwick the Kingmaker. Anne was also the widow of Edward VI's son, Edward of Westminster, who had died at the Battle of Tewkesbury. This union would see Richard engage in a bitter land dispute with his brother Clarence, who had married Warwick's elder daughter, Isabel. Both brothers were possibly trying to gain control of their late father-in-law's lands to increase their own wealth and power. However, it's also possible that both marriages were born of love, as both men had known the Neville sisters since their time under their father's tutelage in his Yorkshire power base during their adolescence. Anne would later be crowned Queen Consort after Richard's rise to power, and would give birth to their only son together, Edward of Middleham, Duke of Cornwall, Earl of Chester and Salisbury, and future Prince of Wales. It was claimed that toward the end of Anne's life, when she lay dying of tuberculosis in March 1485, accuracy of this claim is disputed, and may, like so many events of Richard's life, have been twisted for political purposes. In addition to inheriting land in Wales and northern England as a result of his marriage to Anne, Richard also took responsibility for the administrative body of the Council of the North. During his tenure, he suppressed conflict in the region and brought the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland under his influence. This led over time to Richard becoming popular with the northern nobility and its population, as he was responsible, along with his brother, King Edward IV, for bringing prosperity and economic opportunities to the region. He continued this work after becoming king by placing his northern lords in positions of power, which proved unpopular with some Bassics, as he was accused of using them to bolster his position. Despite Richard's chivalrous activities in the north of the country, there are accounts that depict his disposition as malicious and callous, especially surrounding the trial and execution of his brother, Clarence. Isabel, Clarence's wife, had died under mysterious circumstances in December 1476, probably from consumption. But Clarence maintained that she had been poisoned by one of her ladies-in-waiting, whom he had executed shortly afterward. After this, Clarence sought to marry the daughter of Mary, prompting Clarence to leave the king's court in protest. This ignited suspicions against him, and shortly afterward a number of his retainers were arrested, tried, and executed. Clarence then appointed a former Lancastrian supporter, Dr. John Goddard, to protest his retainers' deaths in Parliament, which resulted in Edward having Clarence arrested and put on trial. During this trial, his brother was not allowed to defend himself, and after being found guilty, Clarence was executed in the Tower of London on February 18, 1478. Richard was portrayed after his own death as greeting his brother's trial with approval. as both he and his wife were named as the principal beneficiaries of Clarence's estates. However, there exists no concrete evidence linking Richard with Clarence's trial or death, and once again the responsibility must surely lie with the head of state. Of Edward IV's wife, Elizabeth Woodville, and her family, whose main aim was to ensure that her son, the future Edward V, succeeded his father. Clarence had demonstrated in the past that he posed a threat to the crown and could have become a potential threat to the Prince of Wales in the future. The real story behind Clarence's death may be forever lost to history, but what is known is that at his mother Cecily's request, Clarence did not face a traditional execution. Evidence from his exhumed remains suggests that he was not beheaded, and popular myth states that he was instead drowned in a vat of wine. By the late 1470s, a confrontation was brewing with England's old enemy to the north, the Kingdom of Scotland. After war was declared in November 1480, Richard, as Warden of the West March, led a successful campaign in the border region and eventually captured the city of Berwick upon Tweed in August 1482, which was the final time the city changed hands between the two rival kingdoms. During this campaign, Richard also occupied Edinburgh for a short period, but was unable to bring Scottish King James III to battle. The invaders, afterward, the English were forced to return to Berwick. Richard's exploits in Scotland greatly impressed his brother, as well as the English nobility, and he was rewarded with further lands and titles, such as High Sheriff of Cumberland, and was also permitted to retain many of the lands he appropriated during his Scottish campaign. But then came the event that would change Richard's life, as well as the entire course of English history. And within a matter of weeks, it became clear that the king was dying. During his final days, the king declared his 12-year-old son Edward as his successor, but also named his brother Richard as Lord Protector until the young king came of age, when King Edward IV died at age 40. On April 9, 1483, his remains were laid to rest at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, 2 days after his brother's death. Richard took an oath of loyalty to his nephew, Edward V, but following King Edward's death, Richard faced opposition among the nobility, such as the Woodvilles, who had grown into a powerful political force during the late king's reign. The Woodvilles still maintained a great deal of influence at the time of Edward's passing, and were now working to alienate Richard from the governmental process. However, as the low-born family was hated among the established nobility, many of them threw their support behind the Lord Protector, including loyal Yorkist nobles such as William Hastings, 1st Baron of Hastings, who was the Lord Chamberlain to the old king. Richard saw this withdrawal of support from the Woodvilles as a sign of disrespect, and he responded by assuming responsibility for young Edward V, seeking to place him under his protection, as he was accountable for Edward's safety as Lord Protector. It should be noted that Richard was not alone in this act, nor was he the instigating party, as it is stated in the Croyland Chronicle, written by the Benedictine monk Ingulf, that Richard acted upon instructions from Lord Hastings, who informed him and his ally Henry Stafford, 2nd Duke of Buckingham, that the Woodvilles were planning to take control of the country. Richard then rode to Northampton on April 29, 1483, and intercepted Elizabeth Woodville's brother, Anthony Woodville, 2nd Earl Rivers, who was escorting the young king to London for his coronation. Along with a heavily armed 2,000-strong bodyguard, the young king, however, was not present when Richard arrived, as he had been sent south of Northampton to the small town of Stony Stratford before the Lord Protector's arrival. After dining with Rivers and his entourage, Richard had them arrested, placed charges of treason against them, and then travelled to intercept the young king before escorting him for his own safety to Bishop Kemp's palace in London. Afterward, he was moved to the royal apartments at the Tower of London, where kings traditionally resided before being crowned. Following his return, the King's Council officially proclaimed Richard as regent to his nephew, and it was also decided that the coronation should be postponed for 7 weeks, and then later for 3 months. After this, on June 13, 1483, Richard, along with the Duke of Buckingham, turned on his old ally Baron Hastings during a council meeting at the Tower of London, and accused him of plotting against his life with the Wood vis. It is unclear what happened next, but some accounts state that Hastings, along with a number of his companions, were dragged from the tower and summarily executed moments later, even though he had been a loyal supporter of Richard in the past. During this period, Richard also attempted to place Earl Rivers on trial for treason, but was barred from doing so by the King's Council. However, Rivers was ultimately executed in Richard's stronghold of Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, 1 day before Richard was proclaimed as king on June 25, 1483. Upon hearing of her brother's arrest, on April 30th, the late King Edward IV's wife, Elizabeth Woodville, had sought refuge in Westminster Abbey along with her children, including 9-year-old Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. She then handed over her son to the Archbishop of Canterbury, thinking that he would be safe, assuming that her elder son's coronation was imminent. After this, a clergyman, thought to have been the Bishop of Bath and Wells, is thought to have informed Richard that his brother Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, as the late king had, before their union, entered into a legal pre-contract to marry the daughter of John Talbot, 1st Earl of Shrewsbury, Lady Eleanor Talbot. Then, on June 22, 1483, a sermon was held outside the old St. Paul's Cathedral, which stated that both Edward V and the Duke of York were illegitimate, as their parents' marriage was invalid. Afterward, a petition was drawn up, which was signed by nobles and commons alike, asking Richard to assume the throne, which he subsequently agreed to on June 26, although the marriage between Edward and Elizabeth was declared illegitimate by Richard and his supporters. If sources are accurate, Lady Talbot died in June 1468, and Edward V was born on November 2, 1470, meaning that he was not born during Lady Talbot's lifetime. Even if the claims of Edward IV's pre-contract are true and valid, he was a widower 2 years before the birth of his heir. On the other hand, Richard and his supporters would argue that because Edward and Elizabeth had married 4 years before Lady Talbot's death, any children they had together would have been illegitimate. The validity of Richard's accession has always been disputed, as the Parliament of 1483 had not yet officially convened. However, based on a precedent set by Edward in 1461, an informal gathering of officials satisfied legal requirements to declare him King Richard. Duke of Gloucester was then crowned King Richard III of England at Westminster Abbey on July 6, 1483, and his ascendancy was later ratified by an Act of Parliament called the Titulus Regis in 1484, which deemed him to be the rightful king. This ratification of Richard as king has led some to argue that the label placed upon him as a usurper is unwarranted, but as the act was repealed and destroyed when King Henry VII took power, the historical narrative regarding the motivations and legitimacy of Richard's actions are clouded, ambiguous, and open to different interpretations. Among the guests at Richard's coronation were a number of former Lancastrian supporters, including the mother of Henry Tudor, Margaret Beaufort, and her fourth husband, Lord Thomas Stanley, 1st Earl of Derby, who would each eventually play prominent roles in Richard's downfall. During the summer of 1483, Richard secured London and suppressed dissent with the aid of his troops. During this time, his men allegedly prevented an attempt to free the princes from the Tower, and shortly afterward, Richard left London and embarked on a tour of England. At this time, rumors started to circulate that the princes, Edward and Richard, had disappeared from the Tower of London, and by the end of summer 1483, there were widespread suspicions that the boys were missing or dead. The only concrete fact regarding their disappearance is that they were no longer seen after summer 1483, and the story surrounding what happened to them remains a mystery, although alternative narratives have been suggested as to who may have killed the princes, or even if they were killed at all. It is said that until his death, Richard did not attempt to defend himself regarding the whereabouts of the boys, and remained silent on their fate for the rest of his life, which some saw and still see as an admission of his guilt. One of the few accounts of the prince's disappearance comes from an Italian gentleman named Dominic Mancini, who visited England during summer 1483. In his report, Mancini insisted that Richard was responsible for the prince's deaths, though his account has been questioned since, as he relied on the testimony of a royal doctor named John Argentine, who was a loyal supporter of Edward VI and later Henry VII. Additionally, Sir Thomas More, a Tudor historian, also claimed that Richard had ordered the princes to be killed, and stated that one of his most trusted knights, James Tyrrell, confessed to the murder, stating that the princes were suffocated in their beds by two of Tyrrell's men, Miles Forrest and John Digghton. In contrast to this, others have named Richard's ally, Henry Stafford, 2nd Duke of Buckingham, as the man behind the murders, as he himself had a claim to the crown as a descendant of John of Gaunt, and it is proposed that he may have intended to take the crown for himself, and was not acting upon Richard's authority. Other theories regarding the prince's disappearance claim that Henry VII himself ordered their murder after coming to power, although there is no evidence for this, as if he had done so, Henry could have produced the bodies as proof that Richard had been responsible. Later historical events also raised fresh doubts over the fate of the princes in the Tower, when Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be the younger prince, Richard Duke of York, staged a coup against Henry VII in the 1490s, but was ultimately imprisoned, admitted to being an impostor, and was then hanged in 1499 after a number of escape attempts. Once again, the truth behind the boys' deaths is lost in the mists of time. But one possible clue to their fate was discovered during excavations around the Tower of London in 1674, which revealed a small wooden box containing the skeletons of two children. However, these remains have never been formally examined using modern technology, as forensic investigations have not yet been authorized to determine if the bones are of the period in question or share any DNA with Richard. III's recently discovered remains. What is certain is that the mother of the princes in the Tower, Elizabeth Woodville, had just cause to blame Richard and his supporters for the disappearance of her sons, as he, after all, had been charged by her late husband Edward IV to ensure their safety, which, be he innocent of their deaths or not, he failed to do. This affair, which remains one of the most notorious events in the history of the English monarchy, who was the godmother of one of Elizabeth's daughters, and whose stepson, George Stanley, heir of Lord Thomas Stanley, was married to Elizabeth's sister, Lancastrian King Henry. But Thomas, who had inherited his father's lands and titles in 1459, showed an incredible talent for choosing the winning side in battles, as he had previously refused to commit his troops at the Battle of Blue Heath in September 1459, even though he had been ordered to by the late Henry VI's wife, Queen Margaret of Anjou. This pragmatism, or disloyalty, eventually resulted in Stanley becoming one of the richest and most powerful noblemen in the land, as he became a supporter of Edward IV during the middle stages of the Wars of the Roses, and his position was then strengthened immeasurably by his marriage to the 3 times widowed Lady Margaret Beaufort, who had inherited her late father, the Duke of Somerset's lands, as well as those of her previous husbands, before Lady Margaret had married Thomas Stanley. She had, in her second marriage, been the wife of the Lancastrian supporter, Edmund Tudor, 1st Earl of Richmond, whose father, Owen Tudor, had married King Henry VI's mother, Catherine of Valois, after the death of her first husband, King Henry V. Edmund. Tudor had himself been taken prisoner by the House of York in the early stages of the Wars of the Roses, but died of the plague while imprisoned, leaving pregnant Margaret, widowed at the tender age of 13, in November 1456. 2 months later, she gave birth to her only child, Henry Tudor, the future nemesis of Richard III, at Pembroke Castle in Wales. Margaret then started to position her son as a candidate to lead the opposition to Richard III, and even though Henry was hardly a strong candidate in terms of his ancestry, there were few other Lancastrian candidates left alive, as his mother's husband, Lord Stanley, was one of the most powerful nobles in England, and the Woodvilles were eager to claim revenge on Richard. Henry was the right man in the right place at the right time. Henry Tudor's claim to the English throne derived from his mother, as Lady Margaret was the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, 3rd son of Edward III, who had fathered 4 illegitimate children with his mistress and later wife, Catherine Swynford, one of whom was Margaret's grandfather. John Beaufort taught Henry had spent most of his life away from England in exile in Brittany, as he had fled the country after King Edward IV's final victory over the House of Lancaster. Despite him now being the most prominent Lancastrian claimant after the deaths of Henry VI and his son, neither Edward IV nor Richard III took his claim seriously enough to eliminate him, which would prove to be a fatal mistake. Lady Margaret and Elizabeth then concocted a brilliant plan, which would see Henry Tudor marry Elizabeth Woodville's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, and form a union between the houses of Lancaster and York that would potentially attract supporters from both of the competing factions who were disaffected with Richard III's rule. This agreement attracted many of the old King Edward IV's Yorkist supporters, who, to say the least, were unhappy with Richard III's ascension to the throne, as well as the disappearance of the princes. Soon after the new king's coronation in late summer 1483, a plot was well underway to depose him. This culminated in Richard III's old ally, the Duke of Buckingham, as well as John Morton and Reginald Bray, raising an army in support of Henry. However, after a great storm engulfed the English Channel, Tudor was stranded off the south coast, resulting in the Buckingham Rebellion, as it is now known, fizzling out, after which Buckingham himself was captured and executed in November 1483. After the failed Buckingham Rebellion, Richard sought an agreement with the officials of the Duke of Brittany to hand over Henry to his custody. However, after Tudor received word of these plans, he escaped to France, where he gained the backing of his host. In Rennes Cathedral on Christmas Day, 1483, Henry officially declared his intention to marry Elizabeth Woodville's daughter, Elizabeth of York, after which he stepped up his plans for a second invasion. Although Richard III's reign is arguably the most famous of any Plantagenet king, he only sat on the English throne for just over 2 years. During this time, he held his only parliament in 1484, in which he negotiated the raising of funds in return for abolishing the benevolence levy, which kings had used in the past to raise money without Parliament's consent, and also agreed to protect English merchants' trade from their foreign competitors. During this time, Richard also extended power to the justices of the peace by granting officials the authority to implement bail measures for detainees, and also introduced legal protection for accused citizens, which prevented illegal seizures of property as they awaited trial. Additionally, the king introduced a system of legal representation named the Court of Requests for those who were unable to afford legal costs, in which poorer citizens could petition the crown regarding disputes. Richard also oversaw a process by which the laws of the land were translated from the usual Latin or French into English, so that commoners were better informed of their rights. It could be said that many of these reforms fly in the face of the picture that has been handed down to us of Richard, as he genuinely seems to have concerned himself with the lives of his subjects. However, the king would never get the chance to prove what kind of king he really was, as the final battle of the Wars of the Roses was now fast approaching. Richard had, after the failed Buckingham Rebellion, confiscated the lands of Elizabeth Woodville, who was still living in England at this time, along with those belonging to Henry Tudor's mother, Lady Margaret, as a punishment for their involvement. However, he handed the latter's lands over to her husband, Lord Stanley, perhaps through fear of him officially joining his wife against Richard, as his support base was now far from secure in many ways. Lord Stanley was Richard's biggest problem, as his position had been greatly weakened by his perceived involvement in the disappearance of the princes in the Tower. Therefore, he could not afford to lose the support of any more nobles, let alone one so powerful as Stanley. In the meantime, Henry Tudor's plans for launching a second invasion of England were gathering pace, as he had now gained the backing of the French court, who supported his invasion in order to prevent Richard from interfering with their own planned invasion of the Duchy of Brittany. Tudor was then forced to act quickly and hasten his departure after word reached him that Richard III's wife, Anne Neville, had died in March 1485. And the king was now planning to marry Elizabeth Woodville's daughter, Elizabeth of York, himself, which could have potentially unraveled the fragile alliance Henry had with his former Yorkist supporters. Richard III's position had also been greatly weakened in April 1484, when his son and heir, Edward of Middleham, the Prince of Wales, died of unknown causes, which was seen by many as divine retribution for his apparent involvement in the disappearance of the princes in the Tower. Henry Tudor then quickly gathered an army in France, with the support of the French King Charles VIII, which totaled as many as 5,000 professional mercenaries, and possibly a small contingent of Scottish troops. After this, he set sail from Harfleur on August 1st, 1485, and landed on the Welsh coast at Milford Haven on August 7th, not far from his birthplace at Pembroke Castle. After this, Henry's army progressed through southern and central Wales, gathering supporters as they went, until it finally crossed the English border near Shrewsbury. Following this, Henry held several secret meetings with his stepfather, Lord Stanley, who had gathered his own forces in the area, and afterward in Wales on August 11, and had since been gathering his supporters throughout the country at his rallying point in the city of Leicester. After this, Richard then learned that Henry Tudor was himself marching toward Leicester, as he had supporters in the area he hoped would join him. Therefore, the Yorkist army, which consisted of between 7,500 and 12,000 men, took up a defensive position on a hill roughly 15 miles west of Leicester, and awaited their enemy's arrival. Although the Battle of Bosworth Field has for centuries been thought to have taken place just south of Market Bosworth, the actual site of the battle has recently been the subject of debate, as the earliest reference to the confrontation taking place at Bosworth was written 25 years after the event, and historians now think the real site of the battle to be nearly 2 miles southwest of the traditional site. What is known is that, on the morning of August 22nd, 1485, Richard took up a defensive position on a hill to the east of the battlefield, opposite Henry's army, which now numbered in the region of 5,000 to 8,000 men, while Lord Stanley took up a separate position to the south of both Henry and Richard's forces, although the exact details of the day are debated. One version of events is that the initial engagement occurred between the men of Richard's second in command, John Howard, 1st Duke of Norfolk, on the Yorkist right, and Henry's commander, John de Vere, 13th Earl of Oxford, who commanded the main body of the Lancastrian army. These two contingents, after a short artillery barrage, then engaged one another, while Henry looked on to the rear. After fierce hand-to-hand fighting, the Lancastrians started to gain the upper hand. To counter this, Richard then ordered the commander of his left flank, Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, to attack the Lancastrians. But Percy stood firm, as he perhaps feared his men would be caught in the boggy ground in front of their position, or possibly also feared being attacked in the rear by Lord Stanley's forces to the south. Richard, who was fast running out of options, then made a decision that would change the course of English as well as world history. He saw that Henry and his mounted bodyguard were exposed in front of him, and on the spur of the moment ordered a massed cavalry charge in the hope of killing Tudor. The king and his men then thundered down the slope and crashed headlong into Henry's bodyguard. In the onslaught, his standard-bearer was killed, and Richard came to within feet of his rival. But the charge soon lost its momentum, and Lord Stanley, who had been watching the fighting to the south, ordered his brother William Stanley to attack Richard's flank, and shortly afterward, the king's men were falling all around him. It is perhaps no surprise that Stanley came to the defense of his stepson Henry, as he, after all, was married to his mother, And as Richard had held his son George hostage during the battle and had even threatened to execute him if he did not receive support, it is possible that Stanley took the opportunity to kill Richard in an act of revenge. The king, who had by this time been unhorsed, then gathered his dwindling troops around him and, supposedly, after being compelled to retreat, cried, "God forbid that I retreat one step. I will either win the battle as a king or die as one." Richard's men were then slain one by one around him until he was virtually the last man standing, when finally a blow was delivered to his head which floored him, and he was then surrounded and killed by Henry's men. Later examination of King Richard's remains have confirmed that he received 9 wounds to his head, and no doubt countless more to the soft tissues of his body. And it is a testament to his bravery that after the battle, Henry Tudor's official historian, Polydore Virgil, said of his death, "King Richard alone was killed fighting manfully in the thickest press of his enemies." Henry was then declared king on the battlefield by Lord Stanley, and afterward Richard's corpse was brought to Leicester naked on horseback to prove that he was in fact dead and that Henry Tudor was triumphant. King Richard III was the last king of England to die on the battlefield when he was killed by the forces of Henry Tudor, who afterward soon established himself as the supreme ruler of the country and reigned as King Henry VII for just short of a quarter of a century. In 1486, Henry VII fulfilled his promise and married Elizabeth of York, a marriage which was intended to end the royal blood feud between the competing houses, as it united the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York, which Henry would later merge to form the famous Tudor rose for over 500 years. The location of Richard III's body was thought to have been lost until in September 2012, archaeologists announced that the foundations of Greyfriars Church in Leicester had been located. On September 20th, remains of an adult male with a curved spine were found under the choir of the old church. Then, after DNA tests were carried out with the help of descendants of Richard III's sister Anne of York, it was confirmed on February 4, 2013, that the body was in fact that of the last king of the Plantagenet dynasty. Finally, on March 26, 2015, Richard III was given a burial fit for a king of England at Leicester Cathedral. Richard III is today regarded as being one of the most famous and notorious kings in English history, as despite him ruling for a relatively short period of time, the dramatic events surrounding his rise to power, as well as his downfall, have ensured his name remains a household word to this very day. In many ways, his life and death exemplifies the cruel and unpredictable nature of power politics of the late medieval era, and his demise marked the end of what many consider to be the most turbulent and bloody conflict in English history. Although Richard has largely been characterized as a villain in the centuries since his death, mainly by his Tudor enemies and their descendants, there have been efforts in recent years to try and ascertain what the truth really is regarding his life and character. And it is fair to say that he was certainly not the pantomime villain he was portrayed to be. Recent developments have also confirmed that he was not the sinister, hunchbacked monarch of Shakespeare's play, but instead suffered from the fairly common complaint that is scoliosis, or curvature of the spine, which in the medieval period many may have seen as a sign of wickedness or evil. Nevertheless, malevolence was something which was attributed to Richard after his death, and is illustrated most in a contemporary painting by an unknown artist, which was altered sometime after his demise to portray him as having looked sinister and more deformed than he really was. It is certainly true that Richard was a capable ruler, and was particularly popular in the north of England, where he is said to have been a just and honorable lord. Therefore, it could be said that he was not a tyrant or oppressive in his rule, unlike some of his forebears. But as his reign was so short, there is no certainty as to what kind of king he would have become had he lived. On the other hand, Richard has been accused of many crimes and injustices during his lifetime, most notably the disappearance of the princes in the Tower. Despite there being many theories regarding this episode, the most widely accepted version states that they were murdered on Richard's orders, or those under him, although, as previously mentioned, there is no concrete evidence to confirm that he was responsible, and it is probably a subject that will forever be open to debate. Perhaps a fair assessment would be that Richard was a man of his time, who grew up during one of the most destructive and brutal conflicts in English history, where ruthlessness was essential in order to survive, as both sides inflicted injustices on one another during the Wars of the Roses. It is perhaps unfair, as well as unwise, to look at any person involved as being entirely good or entirely bad. What is certain is that the details of King Richard III's life will forever be hotly debated among academics and the public at large, as we will probably never know who he really was or what really happened during the penultimate years of the Wars of the Roses. And so, dear listener, as our tale of Richard III draws to a close, let yourself drift gently into sleep, carried by the whispers of medieval England and the echoes of a king whose story continues to fascinate us centuries later. Tomorrow night, we shall continue our journey with Part 2, exploring the reign of Henry VIII, the Tudor monarch whose quest for a male heir would transform England forever. Until then, may your dreams be filled with the peaceful fields of England, far from the clash of steel and the cries of battle, where the white rose of York finally found its rest beneath the quiet stones of Leicester Cathedral. Sweet dreams. And thank you for joining us on Sleepy Crown. Henry, later known as King Henry VIII of England, entered this world on the 28th day of June in 1491, within the walls of the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich, just outside London. His father was King Henry VII, the first monarch of the House of Tudor, who had seized England's throne at the conclusion of the Wars of the Roses and reign from 1485 until his death in 1509, when his second son and namesake would succeed him. Henry VIII's mother was Elizabeth of York, daughter of King Edward IV, who had ruled England for most of the period between 1461 and 1483 as a Yorkist princess. Her marriage to Henry VII had allowed reconciliation and healing between the two great houses of York and Lancaster after years of devastating civil war. She bore her husband 7 children in total, though only a few would survive to adulthood before Henry's birth. A boy and a girl named Arthur and Margaret had appeared in 1486 and 1489 respectively. 3 daughters and another son would follow after Henry's arrival, though of these only Mary, born in 1496, would live long. Elizabeth, Edmund, and Catherine all perished in infancy or their early childhood years, as was tragically common in that era. As the second son of his parents, Henry was never expected to inherit the crown. Instead, that sacred duty would fall to his older brother Arthur, who bore the title Prince of Wales. Henry consequently grew up as the royal spare rather than the heir, a position that would shape his character in ways that would later influence the entire course of English history. Young Henry received an exceptional education at the palace at Eltham, where he was raised under the careful guidance of several distinguished tutors. These learned men taught him grammar, rhetoric, history, philosophy, logic, arithmetic, and numerous languages, including French, Spanish, Italian, Latin, and Greek. Henry displayed an equal facility for both athletic pursuits and musical endeavors, and it was said that he composed music of his own at various times throughout his life, although it becomes difficult to remember when considering the obese individual with a debilitating leg injury that he became in later life. As a young man, Henry was remarkably athletic and vigorous. The poet John Skelton educated Henry in his moral duties, while he also developed a fairly devout Roman Catholic faith. His mother Elizabeth taught him to write from an early age, something evidenced by the similarities in their handwriting styles. By the time he learned to write, he already held several major titles, including those of Duke of York, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Earl Marshal of England, and Warden of the Scottish Marches. He might not have been the heir, but Henry VII certainly honored his younger son with many distinguished titles and responsibilities. Henry was the subject of exceptional admiration as a boy, as some of the most celebrated intellectuals in both England and Europe, including Sir Thomas More, the famed author of Utopia, and the Dutch philosopher Desiderius Erasmus, the most celebrated scholar of Northern Europe in the early 16th century, marveled publicly at his intelligence and charisma. More wrote about Henry in his poetry, calling him a savior and a new Messiah, though royal flattery was certainly a commonplace of the early modern period. Both More and Erasmus met Henry as a young man in 1499 at Eltham Palace, and they came away deeply impressed by his scholarly potential and natural charm. Other than these distinguished encounters, Henry spent a largely happy childhood surrounded by his mother, sisters, and paternal grandmother, all of whom openly adored him. Indeed, some historians have speculated that it was Henry's childhood, spent at the center of a circle of adoring women, which made him both an individual who veered toward passionate romance and one who was also possessed of a severe petulance when he did not achieve his desires. On April 2nd, 1502, a tragedy occurred that would fundamentally alter the course of Henry's life and, indeed, English history. His older brother Arthur died, possibly of tuberculosis or of the mysterious sweating sickness, a disease which historians have speculated was either a strain of influenza or a hantavirus of some kind. The death of the heir was, in many ways, the defining moment of Henry's existence. It was absolutely vital that a smooth succession occurred when Henry VII eventually died. He had claimed the throne after defeating the Yorkist usurper, King Richard III, at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. Not long before this, Richard had seized the throne by imprisoning his nephews and, in all likelihood, having them murdered in the Tower of London. This brutal act on Richard's part had ensured that many people in England were happy to support Henry Tudor's cause in 1485. Yet there was also no doubt that the House of Tudor had a very tenuous claim to the throne of England, being descended through a line from the great 14th century King Edward III that was widely considered to be illegitimate, as it stemmed from Edward's fourth son, John of Gaunt's marriage to Catherine Swynford and the children born out of wedlock from that union. Moreover, the Tudors were largely a Welsh family, not something which blocked their path to the throne legally, but hardly something which the ancient noble houses of England would have viewed favorably. Unsurprisingly, there had been numerous revolts against the Tudors in the late 1480s and into the 1490s as Henry was growing up. For Henry VII, it was all too clear that a new rival for the throne could emerge at any time, and so it was vitally important that a smooth transition of power occurred when he himself died. Thus, Arthur's death in 1502 was a major blow to the dynasty's security. The succession now rested on young Henry's shoulders, and this concern for having a male heir and ensuring a smooth succession would hang like a shadow over Henry's entire life. Henry VII now took direct control of his 10-year-old son's education, who was quickly anointed as the Prince of Wales. This marked the beginning of a battle between father and son, as while Arthur was still alive, Henry had been somewhat ignored by the king. Now that Arthur was dead and Henry was the Prince of Wales, the stern and forbidding Henry VII became heavily involved in his son's daily life. This soon resulted in many clashes of will between the two, chief among which was a disagreement over Henry's passion for jousting and other martial sports, activities which Henry VII, young Henry, was embarrassed at being restricted to competing in unarmed training exercises only, while his friends were able to both exhibit their skills and defend their manly honor in the joust. On top of this, over the next few years, father and son drifted apart as Henry VII became an increasingly unpopular ruler on account of his financial policies and his employment of a close coterie of secretive advisors who alienated much of the political nation from the king. Meanwhile, Prince Henry was looked toward as the young king-in-waiting who held out promise of a brighter future. While Henry VII's prudent government might have earned him the resentment of his subjects, he would ultimately put the English state on a sound financial footing and bequeath a large surplus to his son one day. Another major feature of the years after Arthur's death concerned his widow and the issue of Henry marrying. In 1501, before his untimely demise, Arthur had married Catherine of Aragon, daughter of King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile, whose own union had united the two major kingdoms of Spain. The marriage of Arthur and Catherine had been designed to foster an alliance between England and Spain. Arthur's death seemed to destroy this arrangement, though almost immediately thereafter, Henry VII had begun corresponding with Catherine's parents in Spain about the possibility of Catherine now marrying Prince Henry instead. The negotiations wound on interminably through the 1500s, all throughout which time Catherine remained in England. The issues around it concerned Catherine's dowry, or marriage portion, that would be paid to the English crown by her parents, and also whether or not Catherine and Arthur had consummated their marriage. If they had, Henry could not marry Catherine according to canon law. The deliberations about the proposed marriage were still ongoing 7 years later, when Henry VII died on April 21st, 1509. When his father died, the Prince of Wales was immediately proclaimed as King Henry VIII of England. An atmosphere of hope and joy prevailed among the nobles, courtiers, gentry, and commoners alike throughout England, and many predicted the beginning of a golden age for England as the tall, athletic, and handsome Henry, with his intelligence, charm, and humor, ascended the throne at 17 years of age. He would soon be married. Only 3 weeks after his father's death, on June 11th, 1509, Henry married Catherine in a brief, private ceremony at the Church of the Observant Friars, just outside Greenwich Palace. She was 6 years older than Henry, and there were lingering issues about the validity of the marriage in canon law. But a papal dispensation was granted to allow it to proceed. Despite how contentious it would become in later years, Henry and Catherine's marriage was a happy one initially. He truly respected her, probably more so than any of his other wives. For her part, Catherine was a devoted wife, even long after Henry had ceased wanting her to be. 2 weeks after the royal wedding, on June 24th, 1509, Henry and Catherine were crowned King and Queen of England in Westminster Abbey. The procession route from the Palace of Westminster to the Abbey was decorated with cloth, gold, and exquisite tapestries, and both Henry and Catherine were resplendent in their ceremonial garment. Henry wore a jewel-decorated cloth's gold coat with a red velvet ermine-trimmed robe, and Catherine was dressed in a rich mantle of cloth of tissue with a silk circlet of gold and pearl on her head, her long auburn hair unbound. The Archbishop of Canterbury, William Warham, anointed the royal couple with holy oil and crowned them both to cries of Vivat, Vivat Rex, long live the king. It was the last time that a joint coronation of a king and queen would take place. In England for nearly 2 centuries, with most of the 6 monarchs that followed being unmarried at the time of their coronation. After the initial ceremony, 2 days of feasting and armed tournaments followed, including the jousting tournament, which Henry's father had so disapproved of. The first years of Henry's reign were indeed good ones. The court was purposefully modeled after those of the warrior kings of the medieval period, and Henry and his courtiers enjoyed both watching and participating in the frequent rounds of jousts and tournaments. Unlike his father, the new monarch spent extravagantly on clothing, jewels, and fine furnishings, while the richest foods were served daily, often with as many as 7 courses served at mealtimes. There also seemed to be good news immediately for securing the line of succession, with Catherine visibly pregnant by the winter of 1509. However, at the very end of January 1510, Catherine miscarried. She was carrying a baby girl. 1 year later, in January 1511, Catherine gave birth to a son, Prince Henry, who tragically only survived for 7 weeks before passing away. The cause of his death remains unclear. 2 further children came and went in the autumn of 1513 and the early winter of 1514. Both sons, both being either stillbirths or children who died within hours or days of their birth. The information from this period is not entirely clear, but the pattern was becoming distressingly apparent. Henry's famous reputation as a tyrant might lead some to believe that Catherine's initial failure to produce an heir for England may have been a point of contention between the Queen and her husband. In fact, Henry and Catherine's marriage continued in a seemingly warm and supportive state for several years. Henry appears to have been both patient and understanding with patience. In 16th century England, child mortality was much more common than it is today, and a wife, especially a noble or royal wife, or their childhood years, depending on circumstances, between 1/3 and half of pregnancies would result in miscarriages, stillbirths, or infant mortality. And while these occurrences were considered tragic, Catherine's demonstrated ability to conceive easily was actually an encouraging sign. That she would eventually give birth to a healthy son and heir. In the meantime, the young royal couple demonstrated impressive collaboration in the governance and management of England's affairs. Henry forgave many of his father's debtors and made efforts to bury the enmity that existed with those who had clashed with his father. His charm and magnanimity won him the support of both the nobility and the people. As well as this, Catherine was beloved for her intelligence, strength, piety, and devotion to the English people. When Henry launched a joint invasion of France, along with the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, in the summer of 1513, he left Catherine to serve as regent in his absence, a clear sign of the trust he placed in her. The war had come about as both an extension of the Italian wars being fought between France and Spain for dominance over the Italian peninsula, and also Henry's desire to reignite the 100 Years' War, which had seen England attempt to conquer much of France in the 14th and 15th centuries. In Italy, Pope Julius II and King Louis XII of France were at war over the Italian states ruled by the papacy. Pope Julius excommunicated Louis, forming a coalition of nations. To sway the young Henry to join them in the league, he sent him barrels of Italian wine, a gold-covered rose, and a shipment of Parmesan cheeses in England. Archbishop Warham had preached for peace and against the evils of war, though eventually Henry had decided differently. In this, he had the support of the Lord Chancellor, Thomas Wolsey, a leading religious figure in England, and soon to be a cardinal of the Church. He was also the chief minister of Henry's government throughout much of the 1510s and 1520s, and an immensely powerful figure. On June 28, 1513, with the decision for war already taken, the King and Queen arrived at Dover Castle in Kent. Henry crossed the English Channel the following day to join the fight against King Louis of France. For the first time in nearly 100 years, since the glory days of King Henry V and the Battle of Agincourt, an English king would now seek to extend his dominion on the continent. Henry's first victory was at Therouanne, followed by a triumph at the Battle of the Spurs, so named because the mounted French knights fled the field so quickly, using their spurs to push their horses onward as rapidly as they could, while Henry pursued his dreams of English martial glory in France. Catherine was busy confronting an invasion of England by the Scots, the perennial ally of the French under King James IV. Within 2 months of Henry's invasion of France, King James invaded England in support of his French allies. Catherine, however, proved equal to the challenge in Henry's absence. Catherine was personally involved in the military mobilization and strategy for England's defense. When the English, heavily represented by longbowmen and led by Thomas Howard, on September 9, 1513, at the battle, the English forces were victorious over a greater Scottish force, and James IV perished on the battlefield, along with as many as 17,000 of his 40,000-strong army, while the English, in contrast, lost only 1,500 of their 26,000-strong host. The Queen, in writing to Henry after the victory, praised him for his successes abroad and sent as a token of her own triumph a shred of the Scottish king's coat to add to the king's banners. As his army carried on to take parts of Flanders as well as Tyrant, where Henry built a great castle, a symbol of what he believed to be his burgeoning continental empire. 3 years later, and 7 years into their marriage, Henry and Catherine's patience was rewarded when, on February 18, 1516, Mary, the future Queen Mary, She would be the king and queen's only child, to live beyond infancy and into adulthood. England rejoiced. Mary's birth and survival, 7 years into the reign, contained the promise that a male heir might follow before long. At the time, no woman had ever been Queen of England in her own right, although, unlike in countries like France, where the Salic law prohibited female monarch, Mary could theoretically succeed her father one day. Henry appeared to treat his daughter as a true Princess of Wales. He even sent her to live at Ludlow Castle, where she was established with her own miniature court, as was the tradition for the heir to the English throne. However, while Henry loved his daughter and referred to her as my pearl in the world, he still pined for a male heir. As the years went by, this would become an obsession that clouded his judgment and slowly turned the loving husband and valiant king who had promised so much in 1509 into a tyrant who tore his own kingdom apart in search of a son. During the course of the 1520s, it became apparent that Catherine would not produce a son and heir. She turned 40 in December 1525, and thereafter her chances of delivering any further children, let alone a boy who was healthy, became slimmer and slimmer. Long before that time, Henry began to take mistresses with more regularity. Such behavior was not necessarily an indication of his waning interest in his wife. Most kings in early modern Europe had one or multiple mistresses. In June 1519, one of these, Elizabeth Blount, a lady-in-waiting to the Queen, gave birth to Henry's son. The king acknowledged the boy as his own child, and he was named Henry Fitzroy Henry, after his father. While Fitzroy literally means son of the king, Henry lavished attention and titles on his son, but under English law he was illegitimate and could not succeed his father. Still, with the birth of Henry Fitzroy, Henry had proven that he could father a son. While the king never openly blamed Catherine for her perceived failure to produce a boy, in Henry and Catherine's previously happy relationship, his dynastic troubles aside, the first 10 years of Henry's reign clearly reflected his ambitious pursuit of glory. Henry set out to make England the equal of both France and Spain in wealth, power, and prestige. Early on in his reign, he sponsored the construction of dockyards, warehouses, and shipyards in coastal ports, and sourced huge amounts of timber from the forests of Sussex and Kent for the construction of a large fleet. Henry's father had become king in the very infancy of Europe's age of exploration. It is, for example, often overlooked that it was a pilot in English employ. English navy remained small by 1509. Henry VIII set about changing this, and by the 1540s it had been expanded to approximately 50 ships. Henry also pioneered a revolution in English international diplomacy. In 1518, with the threat of a Turkish invasion of southeastern Europe looming a prospect which alarmed all Christendom, Henry signed a non-aggression pact with Charles V, the new Holy Roman Emperor and Queen Catherine's nephew, along with Francis I, King of France. The agreement was the beginning of several summits which took place over the next 2 years between the 3 European powers, largely planned and orchestrated by Henry's chief minister, Cardinal Wolsey. The most impressive of these diplomatic meetings was unquestionably the Field of Cloth of Gold, which took place in France, near Calais, from June 7th to 24th, 1520. At the summit, Henry and Francis signed a pledge of perpetual friendship and peace. Princess Mary was betrothed to the Dauphin of France. All in attendance enjoyed a week of feasting, drinking, entertainment, and jousting contests amid the exquisite tents made from gold cloth. However, despite the pomp and ceremony of the Field of Cloth of Gold, the alliance between Henry and Francis would soon collapse, as shortly afterward Cardinal Wolsey negotiated an alliance with Charles V of Spain, who declared war on France later in 1521, starting the Italian War of 1521 to 1526, into which England was dragged, the second of three wars which Henry would fight with France. However, the bulk of the fighting would play out in Italy between the French and Spanish there. Henry was determined to be remembered as a prince of intellect and virtue, as well as one skilled at statesmanship. The growing furor over the writings of Martin Luther in Germany from 1517 onward, and the Protestant Reformation which it inspired, soon presented him with an opportunity to facilitate his learning. Luther had emerged as a grave critic of the papacy in Rome and the wealth and power of the Church in general, arguing that the corruption within it needed to be rooted out and a new form of Christianity established, one in which churches would be stripped of their idolatrous wealth. The Mass would be performed in the vernacular tongues rather than in Latin, and people would be encouraged to actually read the Bible themselves and engage with Scripture. Henry was a doctrinal Catholic who liked the power, ceremony, and tradition of the Roman Catholic Church. In response to the heresy emanating from Central Europe, in 1521 he composed a text entitled Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, or the Defense of the Seven Sacraments. In this work, Henry attacked Luther's ideas, defended sacred Catholic practices, and affirmed in all religious matters the supremacy of the Pope over the Church in Europe. Henry even dedicated the text to Pope Leo X, who, in recognition of his service to the Church, gave Henry the title Fidei Defensor, meaning defender of the faith. Whether Henry actually wrote all of the defense of the seven sacraments remains a matter of debate. Thomas More might well have aided him, and certainly commented on drafts of the text. By the mid-1520s, Henry's marital situation was becoming more strained. He was no longer the popular teenage king, but was still a relatively young man in his 30s. His thoughts had seemingly not turned of their own accord to potentially divorcing Catherine and seeking to remarry to a woman who might bear a son instead. It took the arrival of Anne Boleyn to the Tudor court at this time to lead Henry down this path. Anne was a daughter of Thomas Boleyn, Henry's former ambassador to France. She had recently returned from the French court with her father and was much admired for her cosmopolitan air, her style, wit, and charm. Her year of birth is unclear, though it was probably 1501, making her a woman entering her mid-20s. At the time, Henry became infatuated by her. For the first few months of their courtship, there seemed to be no question of Henry casting off his wife. Anne knew how to handle the king, though. She refused to become his mistress so long as he was married, insisting that she would only commit in such a way to her future husband. Over time, Henry became more and more obsessed, and his letters to Anne, some of which survive, are full of passionate declarations of his love and desire for her. Generally, Anne Boleyn has been depicted as a grasping political climber who usurped Queen Catherine's legitimate place. However, there is no evidence that she encouraged Henry's interest in her initially. Of playing a skillful game of manipulation, it seems unlikely that a young woman like Anne, from a respectable but hardly powerful, there is almost certainly no possibility that she imagined herself as queen one day. Nevertheless, after her abrupt departure from court, Henry continued writing to Anne and sending her gift. In time, Anne began to respond to Henry with feelings of her own, and the two carried on their relationship quite publicly at court after she made her return there. There is no way to know exactly for how long Anne refused Henry's sexual advances. However, the fact that Anne did not become pregnant throughout the nearly 7 years of their courtship suggests she stayed chaste, while Henry and Anne were intimate with one another in other ways. The likelihood is that they did not sleep together prior to 1532. In 1527, a year or so after he began courting Anne, Henry decided to seek a divorce from Catherine so he could marry Boleyn. He and his counselors soon latched on to a potentially legitimate reason for seeking an annulment of his near 2 decades old marriage. When Henry had first married Catherine, he had done so over objections that she had previously been married to his deceased brother Arthur, and that their brief marriage had possibly been consummated. This would have been in breach of canon law, as Leviticus 20:21 reads, "If any man should take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They will be childless." In order to sidestep this issue, it had been argued back in the 1500s that Catherine and Arthur had never actually been together as man and wife, thus allowing Henry to marry Catherine. Now, 18 years after they were first married, Henry very conveniently started to have a fit of conscience. It was soon being argued in England that the marriage in 1509 had been a breach of natural religious law after all. On these grounds, Henry began petitioning Pope Clement VII in Rome for an annulment to his first marriage, whereby he could then marry Anne. The king would spend more than half a decade pursuing what became known at court and in English political circles as his great matter. He would change English political and religious history in the process. The process began with a direct appeal to Pope Clement VII. It was not unknown for popes to grant annulments to marriages on rather dubious legal grounds, where the marriage was one which had not resulted in a male heir. This could avoid disruptive succession disputes and wars. However, there was no possibility of Clement doing so in this case. Right around the time he began petitioning Clement in 1527, the Spanish and imperial armies of Emperor Charles V, Catherine of Aragon's nephew, had sacked and occupied the city of Rome. With the Pope a virtual prisoner of Charles, there was no way he could agree to annul the marriage. Henry then turned to Cardinal Wolsey, who had never failed him and who owed literally all he had to the king. The son of a butcher from Ipswich, he was originally an obscure chaplain until, under Henry's patronage, he was made a bishop, then archbishop, of resolving the king's great matter. Wolsey had not only been Henry's Lord Chancellor, he had also been his mentor. But in time, his failure to procure the sought-after divorce would lead to his ruin. The cardinal, working with Cardinal Campeggio, a special legate appointed by the Pope, set up a legatine court to determine Henry's great matter. But the court was unable to reach a decision, and instead ruled that the issue should be decided by the College of Cardinals in Rome. It is unclear whether Wolsey truly wanted to give Henry his desire, or if he saw the danger of allowing the king to divorce his famously pious Catholic wife and marry Anne, who was rumored to be sympathetic to the small but growing community of Lutheran Protestant reformers that had emerged in London, Oxford, and Cambridge. Whatever his intentions, the failure of the legatine court led to Wolsey's downfall. as Henry commanded his arrest and imprisonment, citing the treasonous tone of letters Wolsey had written to Vatican officials. However, the cardinal, in fact, died of natural causes on his way to London before Henry could ever have him executed. Henry also took possession of Hampton Court, the fabulous palace which Wolsey had personally transformed from a modest country house, setting it up as a royal residence thereafter. Following the cardinal's downfall, Henry did not sit idly by waiting for the Pope to change his mind. Instead, he began to canvass the opinion of theologians at Europe's universities, asking them to study, deliberate, and pronounce a verdict on the merits of his case for divorce. However, Henry would be disappointed twice more, as the majority of university theologians, and later the College of Cardinals, would decide in favor of Queen Catherine, declaring the king's first marriage valid in law. It is unclear when Henry first began to consider repudiating the Pope's authority in England, thus removing the obstacle to his divorce. Anne Boleyn's influence as a Lutheran sympathizer and reformer is entirely plausible, as is the influence of Thomas Cromwell, a figure who had risen as a servant of Wolsey's, but who survived the cardinal's downfall and inveigled his way into Henry's confidence. Around 1529, he would come to dominate the government in the 1530s. Alternatively, the key figure in the king's move toward splitting from Rome was an otherwise little-known clergyman and theology professor from Cambridge by the name of Thomas Cranmer. According to Cranmer, who was at that time a moderate Lutheran but would become a more radical Calvinist in years to come, kings were anointed by God and answered only to God. Therefore, Henry should not have had to pursue his divorce through legal channel. He certainly did not need the permission of the Pope to divorce his wife. This emboldened Henry to formally break with the Roman Catholic Church and pursue a claim to be the supreme head of the Church of England. It would take nearly 2 years for assistance of both Parliament and the English clergy, but by 1532 Henry secured his wish and was formally acknowledged as the supreme head of the Church in England. After being browbeaten, Parliament had legislated a full break with the Pope, stopping virtually all payments of ecclesiastical dues to Rome. Henry made Thomas Cranmer the new Archbishop of Canterbury, the most powerful ecclesiastical appointment in the country, empowering him to oversee enforcement of the new supremacy and the split with Rome. Then, in May 1533, Archbishop Cranmer finally declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid and granted the king his long-desired divorce. By that time, Henry had already been remarried for 4 months, having wed Anne Boleyn in a secret ceremony on January 25, 1533. Anne was pregnant by then, though she and the king probably did not know this on the day of their union, as on September 7, 1533, Anne gave birth to their first child. Though Henry expressed his delight, he cannot but have been disappointed that it was a baby girl. They named her Elizabeth. There were 2 issues. Firstly, Catherine of Aragon was still widely popular, and the majority of the English people sympathized with her cause and that of her and Henry's daughter Mary, who was now being legally excluded from the succession. Secondly, the majority of the English people were still staunch Roman Catholics and viewed figures like Cranmer suspiciously as clerics who were now intent on exploiting the king's marital drama to impose a Protestant Reformation in England. Henry knew he would have to establish control quickly. His answer was the Act of Supremacy, which he proposed following his marriage to Anne, which Parliament passed in 1534. The act required all the king's subjects to swear an oath, recognizing Henry as supreme head of the church and affirming the legality of the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn. Refusal to swear the oath would be considered treason, and all office holders and political figures would be required to swear it. Many refused, chief among them Henry's old friend and mentor, Sir Thomas More. More had largely retired from court and public life in general in 1532, dismayed at the drift of political events, though he had been quite happy to exploit Wolsey's downfall to become Lord Chancellor a few years earlier. As of 1535, he remained one of only a few of Henry's prominent subjects who still had not taken the oath. His refusal to do so soon resulted in More being imprisoned in the Tower. At his trial, when it was clear that he would be found guilty, he loudly affirmed the authority of the Pope and rejected Henry's supremacy over the Church of England. For this, he was sentenced to death for treason, a crime which carried the gruesome penalty of being hung, drawn, and quartered. More's friendship and service to him that Henry commuted his sentence to beheading, before which More declared in a loud, clear voice that he died the king's good servant and God's first. Henry had finally removed all who seemed openly opposed to the new order, appeared to remove the last barrier to the legitimacy of Henry and Anne's marriage. But a dark cloud still hovered. Anne had become pregnant 2 more times in quick succession following the birth of Elizabeth. Yet both pregnancies had resulted in miscarriages. As this occurred, Henry and Anne's relationship was growing increasingly strained due to the Queen's perceived failure to adjust to her new role as wife, as Henry's mistress. She might have been allowed a certain amount of license to speak and act as she pleased. Her prolonged refusal to sleep with Henry likely put her in a rather dominant position as well. However, as Henry's wife and as queen, she was expected to act in a different fashion roles to which she did not easily adjust. All of this took place against the backdrop of her miscarriages and the fact that Henry's second marriage was proving no more successful in terms of producing a male heir than his first dot in the spring of 1536. After another miscarriage, accusations of Anne's alleged adultery abounded at court. Henry chose to believe them. Private interrogations of the Queen's household elicited fantastic claims of her degeneracy, with several individuals accusing her of conspiring against the king, adultery, and even incest with her own brother, George. At a speedy trial that was cobbled together, which Anne was not permitted to be present at, she was found guilty, and on May 31st, 1536, Anne Boleyn was taken to the scaffold and beheaded. With dignity, she spoke briefly and movingly of her love for the king, her sins of pride, and her desire that the people would pray for her. The exact circumstances of her trial have been widely debated, and even half a millennium later, there is no agreement as to whether or not the charges against her were completely or only partially fabricated in order to remove her from the scene as quickly as possible. What we do know is that within 24 hours of his second wife's execution, Henry was already betrothed to one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, Lady Jane Seymour. She soon became his third wife, while Lady Jane, like her family, had sworn the oath of supremacy. She was a pious Catholic. As a result, many people expected that now, with Anne Boleyn gone, Henry would backtrack on some of his radical religious policies. However, the reforms, if anything, accelerated and Henry ordered Thomas Cromwell to begin the dissolution of England's monasteries. Around this time, in 1536, abbeys, shrines, and monasteries throughout England and Wales were suddenly taken under state ownership. The dissolution of the 800 or so monasteries was undertaken for two reasons. Firstly, the Protestant reformers, who had managed to acquire positions of power in England during the early 1530s under cover of aiding the king in his great matter, were opposed to monasticism in general. Protestants viewed the religious orders as worldly organizations that had helped the Pope corrupt the Word of God, and argued that monasticism had no basis in religious doctrine. Secondly, the king was convinced that dissolving the monasteries was a good idea because it would lead to an absolutely enormous financial windfall, as their precious books, gold chalices, and other valuables were sold off, along with their land. With this money, Henry speculated. In the autumn of 1536, a massive uprising broke out in the north of England. This became known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. Henry only quelled it through attempts at appeasement, followed by brutal reprisals. Marching in the name of the king, carrying banners depicting the 5 wounds of Christ, the rebels demanded the restoration of the abbeys, the revival of sacred Catholic ceremonies, and the dismissal of the king's devious ministers that had led him astray in recent times. The rebels numbered an incredible 40,000 strong, the largest army yet seen on English soil in Tudor times. To appease the mob, Henry initially promised them pardons if they dispersed and ended their rebellion. However, when further disturbances broke out, Henry unleashed a brutal repression, and hundreds of rebel leaders were arrested and executed. Indeed, even his own family were not spared Henry's wrath, as when the wife who replaced Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, begged him on her knees to restore the abbeys, he exploded with "Get up! Do not presume to meddle in my affairs. Remember and..." The desecration of the monasteries continued apace for 4 more years. The confiscated wealth briefly made Henry one of the richest monarchs in Europe, while internationally England was viewed as a pariah state by many a country which had adopted the hated Protestant faith. Instead, the king resolved to use his newly appropriated fortune to build up the country's defenses, ordering the construction of hundreds of forts and gun emplacements along the English coast, the materials for which often came from the monasteries and abbeys themselves, making England a veritable island fortress in the process. This formed the blueprint for English defensive and offensive strategies for many years to come. Between 1536 and 1539, Henry was also convinced by Cranmer and others to pursue other avenues to reinforce the new religious life of England. For instance, the 10 Articles of Faith were published in 1536. An English translation of the Bible appeared in 1537, as well as the institution of the Christian man, colloquially known as the Bishop's Book. By 1539, it was clear to Henry that the theological and doctrinal differences between Catholics and Protestants had hardened. Henry realized that preserving his supremacy and securing peace in religious life was going to require uniformity. If he could not simply proclaim it, he would have to impose it by law. Thus, Henry first established a special committee of clergymen to deliberate on 6 doctrinal questions, the answers to which would form the basic articles of faith for the Church of England. Naturally, the committee knew what was expected of them, and they produced 6 articles of faith, which essentially preserved the Catholic doctrines and observance with which Henry and many other conservatives in England were comfortably familiar. English Protestants were crushed, and it seemed that the only aspect of Catholic doctrine which the 6 Articles had left out was allegiance to the Pope. This was what the Henrician Reformation was all about, creating a Catholic Church where Henry, instead of the Pope, was the leader. These religious shifts and turns require some further explanation. The reason for this was that Henry was never a Protestant, a doctrinal Catholic. He had allowed some Protestant reformers to acquire positions of authority within the English Church in the early 1530s, as they had facilitated his divorce. Then he had allowed them to continue introducing a moderate form of Lutheranism in the mid-1530s, as they enriched him through their proposal to dissolve the country's religious houses. But by the end of the decade, as the Protestant faction had nothing left to offer him, he reacted against the earlier reforms and essentially reimposed Catholicism, albeit while maintaining the split from Rome and his own supremacy over the Church of England. This final shift in 1539 and 1540 would be the last major one of the Henrician Reformation. Henceforth, the Church remained doctrinally Catholic down to the end of the reign, and a more thoroughgoing Protestant Reformation would have to wait until the next reign. All of this was overseen by a monarch who appeared increasingly tyrannical. In the 1530s, Henry was widely appreciated as a generous and good-humored monarch in his early days. Explanation for this change of temperament, which is that Henry was in almost constant pain with an ongoing disability. On January 24th, 1536, 2 days before Anne Boleyn miscarried her last child, and 5 months before her execution, Henry suffered a terrible accident in the jousting lists when he fell from his horse. The heavily armored horse then fell on Henry, nearly crushing his leg, and he was unconscious for several hours. When he awoke, he would find that his life had changed forever. His accident had opened an older wound on his leg, which over time became ever more ulcerated. Part of the problem was that 16th century physicians believed that wounds should be left open to allow the pus to continue draining from them, the buildup of which, according to the humoral theory of medicine that prevailed at the time, increasing infections and inflammation. In an age before effective pain relief, his health issues led to a more dour, over 300 pounds later in his life, and had to be carried around court in a reinforced litter. Henry's marriage to Jane Seymour later that same year, and her pregnancy 7 months later, likely brightened Henry's hopes for the future. Henry and Jane had only been married about 15 months when she gave birth to Prince Edward, but tragically Jane would only live for another 2 weeks, dying of puerperal fever after Edward's birth. While overjoyed at the birth of a son, Henry was crushed by Jane's death. Whether it was because she had given him the male heir that he had so long desired, or because they had not been married long enough for Henry's love to fade, the king went into deepest mourning and seclusion. He would not marry again for more than 2 years. However, after all, Henry had himself become king, as his older brother had died prematurely. Thus, people soon began urging him to remarry again and produce a spare heir. Henry's 4th wife was Anne of Cleves, a German princess and sister to the Duke of Cleves. Marriage negotiations were entered into as part of efforts to end England's international isolation by negotiating an alliance with the Schmalkaldic League, an association of small Lutheran principalities in Germany. Henry commissioned the great Tudor court painter Hans Holbein to go to Germany and paint Anne's portrait. But when she arrived in person to England, Henry expressed intense disappointment, screaming abuse at Thomas Cromwell and exclaiming, "I like her not." Yet, because he had already alienated predominantly Catholic Europe, Henry did not wish to offend his new German ally, and so he duly married Anne of Cleves on January 6, 1540. But as the Catholic reaction against the Protestant reforms continued, in the weeks that followed, Henry immediately began to seek avenues to have the marriage annulled. "She has evil smells about her," Henry insisted after the wedding night, seemingly ignoring his own stench from his ulcerated leg. He also claimed that the looseness of her breasts and other tokens indicated that she was not a virgin. Within 6 months, Henry had his marriage to an annulled on the grounds of her supposedly binding pre-contract to marry the son of the Duke of Lorraine. Anne fared better than most of Henry's wives. She accepted the annulment with grace, and Henry gifted her an estate and an annual income. She would live the remainder of her life in England. Henry then imprisoned his Lord Privy Seal, Thomas Cromwell, in the Tower for his mishandling of the king's marriage. Cromwell was beheaded on July 28, 1540. On the same day, her behavior does, however, tell us much about the marriage to the king. Henry was 51 years old when he married Catherine, and growing older, sicker, and heavier all the time. There were rumors also of his impotence. Some historians have speculated that such sexual problems might have formed the basis of Henry's failure to consummate his marriage to Anne of Cleves as well. Under these circumstances, it is hardly surprising that the teenaged Catherine found her new role as queen tedious, unrewarding, even lonely. She began an affair with Thomas Culpeper, one of the royal grooms, arranging clandestine meetings, writing him love letters, and sending him gifts. Rumors of her behavior soon began to circulate, and it eventually came to light that she had also engaged in a sexual relationship with her private secretary, Francis Derham, before marrying the king. Catherine would pay the ultimate price for the mistakes of her tragically short life, as she was beheaded on February 13, 1542, at the age of 19, the day after the executions of both Culpeper and Derham. The political shift and turns of the reign were not entirely confined to England. Henry, for instance, incorporated Wales more fully into the English state through legislation passed in the 1530s and early 1540s. More substantial still were developments in Ireland. The English lordship had first emerged here owing to a partial conquest of the island in the 12th and 13th centuries, but the civil wars of the 15th century had weakened English rule. Though Henry had contemplated leading an army to Ireland at various points in the 1510s and 1520s, he never did so, ultimately considering any money spent in Ireland to be wasted. He had no choice, though, but to act when the son of the Earl of Kildare revolted in 1534. In the aftermath of this, a coterie of officials in Dublin, Irish lordships, was desirable to reaffirm English power in Ireland. Hence, all his predecessors had held the inferior title of Lord of Ireland. This ensured a commitment to expanding English rule on the island, and a major program of conquest and colonization would be entered into from 1546 onward. His sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr. She was attractive, twice widowed, educated, and highly intelligent. The 31-year-old Catherine seemed a good match for Henry. She was a mature, sensible woman who made a marked effort to be a mother to Henry's 3 children and encouraged a much closer, decided to reinstate his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, whom he had previously declared to be illegitimate, to the line of succession after his son Edward. Henry and Catherine seemed to enjoy both a cooperative and companionable marriage. A seemingly good match, they did clash over religious matters. Her second book, Prayers and Meditations, published in 1545, was the first book published by an English. Catherine did not publish her third book, The Lamentation of a Sinner, and the French. Henry fought against King Francis I of France. There were 2 key aspects to this. Firstly, it would be governed as a new English enclave there for a few years before being handed back to the French. The second element of the war. Infant Queen Mary I, who had succeeded her father, James V, when she was just a week old, in December 1542. Marry Prince Edward. Henry's goal in pursuing what became known as the Rough. The children of Edward and Mary one day rule over a united Britain. The war with the Scots was still in full swing when Henry died, and the rough wooing would eventually fail. Like virtually every other element of Henry's foreign policy during his long reign, by late 1546, Henry had become increasingly ill, and, after making a few final adjustments to his will, he withdrew from public view into seclusion at Whitehall Palace. His condition deteriorated steadily over the month of January 1547. Yet Henry's physicians feared to inform him of their strong suspicion that he was dying on the evening. By the time Cranmer arrived, he found that the king's condition was such that he was unable to speak. It was, in many ways, a fitting end to his life and the strange religious changes that occurred during his reign. His son, by Jane Seymour, became King Edward VI. Clearly, as a 9-year-old, he would be unable to rule in his own right for several years. In the interim, his government would be dominated first by his uncle, and in the late 1540s, a much more thorough Protestant Reformation was entered into, and a new Book of Common Prayer, issued as a way for English men and women to engage with God's Word directly. Archbishop Cranmer, whom Henry had raised to such heights in the 1530s, was the architect of much of this. Ultimately, it was a short-lived effort at a radical Calvinist Reformation. As Edward died in the summer of 1553, at just 15 years of age, a brief effort to install Lady Jane Grey, Protestant party at court, in the 2 weeks following the death of Henry's son, proved unsuccessful. With this, Mary Tudor, Henry's daughter, by Catherine of Aragon, came to the throne. Those present as Queen Mary was crowned at Westminster on October 1, 1553, must have wondered what Henry's actions had all been for. Here was his daughter, by Catherine of Aragon, being crowned as Queen of England after all. Protestant, though a very moderate one, she oversaw the creation of an Anglican church that her father would have probably approved of. Henry's life and reign was a fascinating mixture of both the best and the worst of kingly behavior in early, modern Europe. His reign held out high hopes initially and started well, with a happy marriage to Catherine of Aragon and efforts to reassert. In the 15th century, guided by figures like Cardinal Wolsey and Thomas More, the turning point came in the mid-1520s, as it became clear that his marriage to Catherine's son, to ensure the preservation of the House of Tudor's precarious hold on the throne by having a healthy, legitimate son. Over the next decade, Henry VIII tore England apart in pursuit of this goal. Even though Henry himself remained a doctrinal Catholic, his worst inclinations were being followed by the 1530s, with the dissolution of the monasteries being entered into purely for financial reasons. One wife was divorced, 2 were executed. The tragic irony of it all was that the son in question, Edward VI, would only live for 6 years after Henry himself, a minor European power into a significant maritime nation, established the Royal Navy as a permanent force and laid the foundations for England's later imperial expansion. His break with Rome, though initially motivated by personal desires, ultimately freed England from foreign religious control and allowed the development of a distinctly English form of Christianity. The constitutional changes he implemented, particularly the elevation of Parliament's role in religious and dynastic matters. His reign saw the effective incorporation of Ireland as a kingdom rather than a mere lordship. Yet these achievements came at enormous cost. The dissolution of the monasteries, while filling the royal coffer, destroyed centuries of religious and cultural heritage and eliminated the primary source of charity. And his tyrannical behavior in later years, the execution of trusted advisors and 2 wives, that he was responsible for the execution of between 70 and 80,000 people during his 38-year reign, including 2 of his wives, numerous nobles, clergy, and common folk who opposed his religious changes. His treatment of his daughters, particularly Mary, whom he declared illegitimate and excluded from court for years. Political objectives. Henry's obsession with securing the Tudor succession through a male heir dominated his reign and shaped many of his most consequential decisions. This fixation led him to challenge papal authority, fundamentally alter England's religious landscape, and sacrifice personal relationships. On the altar of dynastic necessity, his 6 marriages became the defining narrative of his reign, each reflecting different phases of his character and kingship. Catherine of Aragon represented his early idealism and adherence to European diplomatic traditions. Anne Boleyn symbolized his willingness to break with convention and tradition to achieve his desires. Jane Seymour embodied his hope for dynastic security. Anne of Cleves illustrated his diplomatic pragmatism and the limits of his tolerance. Catherine Howard revealed his declining judgment and increasing paranoia. Catherine Parr demonstrated his need for companionship and stability in his final years. The religious changes Henry initiated had profound and lasting consequences for England and the wider world. The English Reformation, though begun for personal reasons, evolved into a fundamental transformation of English society, culture, and politics. The establishment of royal supremacy over the Church created a model that would influence the development of national churches throughout Europe. Henry's patronage of the arts and learning helped foster the English Renaissance, with his court becoming a center of humanist scholarship and artistic achievement. His support for education, including the founding of Trinity College, Cambridge, and Christ Church, Oxford, contributed to England's intellectual development. The technological and administrative innovations of his reign, including improvement to the legal system, the expansion of royal bureaucracy, and the development of more sophisticated financial mechanisms, helped modernize English government and prepared the ground for England's later emergence as a major European power. However, Henry's fiscal irresponsibility nearly bankrupted the crown, despite the enormous wealth gained from the dissolution of the monasteries. His frequent wars with France and Scotland drained the treasury, and achieved little lasting strategic advantage. The debasement of the currency to fund his military adventures caused significant economic disruption and inflation. His treatment of Ireland, while extending English control over the island, also laid the foundations for centuries of conflict and resentment. The plantation policies, initiated during his reign and expanded by his successors, would have devastating consequences for the native Irish population. Henry's legacy remained deeply contested for centuries after his death. Protestant historians generally praised him as the liberator of England from papal tyranny, while Catholic writers condemned him as a schismatic tyrant who destroyed England's religious heritage. Modern historians have attempted to provide more balanced assessments, recognizing both his achievements and his failures. The discovery of Henry's armor from later in his reign, with its massive 54-inch waistline, provides physical evidence of his transformation from the athletic young king to the bloated, pain-ridden tyrant of his final years. This physical decline paralleled his moral and political deterioration, as the charming, learned prince of 1509 became the suspicious, brutal monarch of the 1540s. The psychological impact of his jousting accident in 1536 cannot be understated. The constant pain from his ulcerated leg, combined with the side effects of the primitive medical treatments he received, likely contributed to the dramatic changes in his personality and behavior during his later years. Henry's relationship with his children reflected the complexities of his character. While he could be affectionate and generous, his political calculations often overrode his paternal instincts. His treatment of Mary during the years following his break with Rome was particularly harsh, as he demanded she acknowledge his supremacy and the illegitimacy of her own birth. His pride in his son Edward was evident, but the boy's youth and the political circumstances surrounding his birth meant that Henry had little opportunity to develop a close relationship with his heir. His affection for Elizabeth was complicated by the circumstances of her mother's execution and the questions surrounding her legitimacy. That the architectural legacy of Henry's reign is still visible today in buildings like Hampton Court Palace, which he expanded from Wolsey's original design, and the coastal fortifications he constructed to defend against French and Spanish invasion. These device forts represented the most advanced military engineering of their time and demonstrated Henry's understanding of the changing nature of warfare. His contribution to English naval power cannot be overstated. The permanent navy he established centered around purpose-built warships like the Mary Rose, transformed England from a minor maritime power into a significant naval force. This naval expansion laid the groundwork for England's later expansions of the seas and its colonial empire. The cultural impact of Henry's reign extended far beyond England's borders. The English Reformation influenced reform movements throughout Europe and contributed to the religious and political fragmentation that characterized the 16th century. The model of royal supremacy over national churches was adopted in various forms by other European late monarchs seeking to assert their independence from Rome. Henry's reign marked the transition from medieval to early modern England. The feudal structures and relationships that had dominated English society since the Norman conquest were gradually replaced by more centralized, bureaucratic forms of government. The old religious certainties of medieval Catholicism gave way to religious pluralism and the beginnings of individual conscience in matters of faith. The printing press, which had arrived in England during the reign of Henry's father, flourished. Under Henry's rule, particularly after he ordered the translation of laws and statutes into English, this democratization of knowledge and legal understanding had profound implications for English society and governance. As our tale of the Tudor tyrant draws to a gentle close, we see in Henry VIII both the promise and the peril of absolute power. His reign demonstrated how personal desires and political necessities could reshape nations, and how the quest for dynasty and legacy could both elevate and destroy those who pursued it. The young prince who had danced at the field of cloth of gold became the aging king who had to be carried in a litter through his palace corridors. The devoted husband who had written love letters to Catherine of Aragon became the tyrant who sent Anne Boleyn to the scaffold. The defender of the faith who had written against Martin Luther became the supreme head of his own church. In Henry VIII, we witness the full complexity of human nature when granted unlimited power, capable of great vision and terrible cruelty, of profound learning and petty vindictiveness, of inspiring loyalty and instilling terror. His reign changed England forever, setting in motion forces that would shape not only his kingdom, but the wider world for centuries to come. And so, dear listener, as the candles burn low in the royal chambers and the echoes of Tudor England fade into the peaceful darkness of sleep, let yourself drift away on the gentle currents of history. Rest now in the knowledge that even the mightiest of kings must eventually lay down their crowns and find their peace. May your dreams be filled with the music of lutes and virginals, the rustle of silk and velvet, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from understanding our shared human story with all its triumphs and tragedies, its heroes and villains, its love and loss. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining us on this journey through England's most controversial monarch. Until we meet again in the gentle realm of Sleepy Crown, may you rest well and wake refreshed, carrying with you the timeless lessons of history's most fascinating figures. Good night, dear dreamer. Henry's life and reign was a fascinating mixture of both the best and the worst of kingly behavior in early modern Europe. His reign held out high hopes initially and started well, with a happy marriage to Catherine of Aragon and efforts to reassert England.